Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers. Michael Kilpatrick here with yet another episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. Today's guest is Rachel Hester, author of the Guide to Homestead Dairy Sheep. Rachel and her family shepherd their flock of sheep on an 8.5-acre homestead in central Kentucky. Passionate about sustainable farming and inspired by her family's health journey, Rachel advocates for the benefits of sheep-based products like milk, wool, and heirloom-quality textiles, blending tradition with modern farm life. Rachel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Give us a little bit of background of how you got started with sheep.
So my best friend growing up had a small homestead, and this was way before homesteading was cool. Like, I don't even think they called it a homestead or even a farm. It was just they had animals in their backyard. And so they had a big garden, and the mom had a yarn store. So there was all kinds of different yarns there of different fiber qualities and stuff, but they also had 2 sheep, 2 llamas, and 18 Angora rabbits. So when I went to their house to play, someone was spinning something or knitting something, and I typically had to help wash or card wool before I was allowed to play on their computer. So that was kind of like my early introduction, ruined me for acrylic forever.
Uh-huh.
And so then when I was 18, I went on the mission field to Romania, and I ate sheep milk cheese for the first time. And that was also where I had raw milk for the first time, and really good food for the first time. I grew up with, if you eat butter, you'll die of a heart attack. Everything has to be boneless, skinless, low fat, etc. And then I went to Romania, and it was like they were literally eating slabs of pork fat between 2 slices of bread with mustard. It was like, how is everyone still alive? And now I know it's because that's actually how we're supposed to be eating. So so I had sheep milk cheese there for the first time, and that just blew everything out of the water. I mean, it was sweeter but tangier, and there was just something my body was really craving with that. So when I left the mission field and went to college and found this little Russian grocery store, and they had sheep milk cheese too. And then we moved away from that city and got our homestead. And I was like, well, we need to have dairy sheep at some point because I want that cheese in my life. And there's nowhere else to get it if I don't make it myself. So that's kind of the baseline of how I got started.
Gotcha. All right. So talk a little bit about if someone is interested in getting started with dairy sheep, what are the main breeds that folks will use?
So the dairy specific breeds we have available in the United States, because we are limited to what due to importation. But right now, the dairy breeds we have are the East Frisian, which is the most popular. That's kind of the whole of the sheep world. And then there is the Awasi, which is the most popular globally. They produce a little bit less milk, but they're hardier. And then there's the ASAF, which is a combination of the two. When I was doing research for my book, I had found information that listed Clune Forest as an actual dairy specific breed, which I've since found out they're not necessarily a dairy class breed, but they have the highest amount of butter fat of all of these did. So they've been put in the dairy sheep category as kind of the Jersey cow of the dairy sheep. But then if you talk to actual Clune Forest people who are part of the Clune Forest Breed Association, they get very irritated. And they're like, no, they're not a dairy breed. They're just a meat breed, which at this point I'm like, well, historically, most breeds of sheep were at one point milks. So it kind of gets a little hairy. So then there's also the Icelandic and Finn sheep, which are still, again, not necessarily classified as dairy sheep per se, but historically there is a rich history of milking them. So, but if you look at the history of almost any breed of sheep, at some point they were milked because shepherds were not picky about what species they were getting their food from. They just wanted food. So.
Gotcha. All right. So breeds are interesting. So talk a little bit about now, obviously, the wool can get in the way too. So, what's most people do, with wool sheep and milking? Is that something you just trim really well, or?
Well, that's one of the things with the dairy specific breeds is they have been selectively bred for certain traits. And one of those is, bare bellies, clean udders, and that kind of
Uh-huh.
thing. So, that is a perk for because I have a mixed breed flock. So my girls with higher dairy breed genetics, they're a lot easier to get to the anatomy. Um,
Yeah,
but in societies where they milk their heritage breed sheep, they do something called crutching, which is they will trim the backside and the area around the udder prior to lambing so that both the lamb and the shepherd has easier access to the udder.
gotcha,
Mhm.
gotcha. All right. Talk a little bit about like the general like cycle. So you obviously you breed them, and does that typically happen late fall? Kind of just like share a year on the sheep dairy.
Sure. So yeah, we breed in the fall. You can instigate a what's called eustrus at different times of the year, but you have to invest in the chemicals. Typically, a vet has to be involved. So the natural cycle is the sheep breed in the fall. A lot of breeds won't actually go into heat unless it's cold enough. So that was one thing we learned the hard way. Our first years, we had Gulf Coast natives, which are from the American South, and then we had a border Leicester, which is from the border region of Scotland and England. And the Gulf Coast all dropped their lambs in March, and the border Leicester dropped her lamb in June.
Gotcha.
So we had a pretty wide lambing window that first year, which I would not recommend repeating. So anyway, so you breed in the fall, and then sheep are pregnant for 6 months. So that's one thing that you can kind of play with. If you breed earlier in the fall, then you'll have an earlier lambing in the spring, which we've kind of played around with. We've had lambs drop in April, May. We've had lambs drop in February. And you kind of have to find the balance between the earlier you lamb, you risk chilled lambs. But on the flip side, the later you lamb, you have higher parasite exposure.
Okay.
So if you get hardier heritage breeds, they can typically withstand the colder temperatures earlier in the year. And so we're finding we kind of prefer the earlier lambing. It's colder for us,
Correct.
but um, those lambs will actually typically grow larger and faster, putting on more weight, which, meat breed sheep shepherds have known for years, but it's just not talked about as much in the dairy world. The earlier the lamb drops, the faster they're going to grow. So you'll have a hardier animal, which you want when you're packing on meat for a larger carcass. So, um, again, we had thought a later lambing was going to be better, but between the heat of our Kentucky summers, the parasite loads, and all that, we're preferring an earlier lambing. So we, write on our calendar when we want lambs to drop, and we back plan 6 months, put our ram in with them. I'll typically leave my ram in for several months just to make sure if there's any variables in the cycles, he can still cover that ewe. And then, about this time, we'll separate the rams and the ewes because this is when we get our nasty weather. So I want all my ewes in one spot, all my rams in one spot so that I can make sure they're, taken care of during the storms.
Uh-huh.
And then we'll have lambing, which I do a lot to set my flock up for success with lambing because a lot of people will hear scary stories about, sheep love to die and lambing's so stressful, etc., which, it's kind of like natural childbirth. People all love the idea of natural childbirth, but they don't know what to do to prepare their bodies to have a successful natural childbirth.
Uh-huh.
So I really invest in good quality minerals for my flock. I don't feed them a ton of grain. And when I do, I'm really choosy about what I'm feeding them. I don't give them corn or soy. Um, I try to make sure the flock is moving around so that the ewes are getting exercise. And I'm really particular about which ewes I keep on and make sure they're good mothers. So that lambing is not very stressful because once you lamb, then you're into milking season, like right out of the gates. So if you have a rough lambing, you're going to have kind of a rough milking season too, because you're still recovering from whatever trauma you had when the lambs were dropping. So, I'm really particular about setting up my flock for success for lambing. And the easier the lambing is for them, the better milk production they're going to have too. So, We will milk for about 5.5 to 6 months, and then we'll dry off our ewes. And I try to give them a little bit of a break before I put the ram back in.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the lambing aspect. I'm assuming the goal is that it's all natural lambing, but sometimes you have to assist. Do you
Mhm.
select for natural lambing?
Yes, I'll give my ewes one pass just because a lot of times if there's a requirement for assistance, it so far has been shepherding error on my part. Like I had the wrong minerals for them, or they were getting too much grain, or I had a ram that was really big and it
Uh-huh.
was a first time ewe. And so the lamb's head was just really hard for her to pass out. So I'll give my ewes one pass just to kind of examine what went wrong. But if it's a multiple assistance lambing, then she needs to go because I just don't have time for that.
Yeah.
So
Now let's talk. You talk nutrition a little bit. Talk a little bit about obviously nutrition while they're growing a lamb, but then
mhm,
after they birth, now they are
mhm,
trying to still grow a lamb while also you're
mhm.
milking them. So talk a little bit about what that typically ends up being.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're going to talk about sheep milking nutrition, you kind of have to wade into the immensely controversial subject of are they 1,000% grass fed or can you give them something to help them out? Which um, our property is a foreclosed acreage. It had no topsoil. It was hay fields for years and years, and it's all full of fescue. So I again give my flock a little bit of grace just because I know they can't get all the nutrition they need to be parasite resistant and raise a healthy lamb and give me extra milk. So I do give them a stanchion mix when I'm milking them. Um, Now, again, I don't do corn and soy. A lot of it is seeds and legumes, or they're traditional grains like barley that shepherds and farmers have been giving their animals for years. I don't give them fast burning grains, and I don't give them a ton. Like I only give them maybe about a quart per milking, and this also just keeps them kind of calm in the milking stanchion because most of my ewes have heritage breeds somewhere in their genetic makeup, which means they're very independent. So I have
Uh-huh.
to bribe them in order to get what I want. So, and I am not above bribery. So I do have a list of the things I put in my stanchion mix in my book. And a lot of people are like, well, what are the measurements? And I'm like, I buy one sack of each thing and take an old coffee can and scoop out one scoop from each bag and dump it in a huge trash bag. And that's my measuring. I'm a very irritating cook. Um,
Uh-huh.
so, the other thing is I make sure that, again, they have free choice minerals. They always have kelp available to them. And then a lot of times I'll add things to their water, like apple cider vinegar or, something like that to make sure that they just have all the extra goodies they need.
Okay. All right. And then can you like replant pasture to try to get more nutrients out of that? Is that something that folks are always doing is trying to increase the fertility of the pasture?
Yeah, so when we first started out, we were one of those people that were like, "Well, Joel Salatin didn't plant his pastures, so
Uh-huh.
we're not going to either." And the last 2 years, we're like, "Yeah, we're gonna plant our pastures." So,
Yeah.
I have been in contact with Reverence Farms. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they have moved their cow herd from feeding supplemental grain to now they feed them um, pastures, and they'll actually do a rotation through the pastures based off what the cows need. So we're talking
Okay.
about how to kind of mimic that with our sheep, and then replant our pastures, with stuff so that I can wean them off the need for a stanchion mix, and they can get what they need from just the paddocks. So it's definitely a good goal to have where you don't have to keep buying in grain just to feed them in the stanchion. But when you're replanting your pastures, there's things to consider too. Like, does this seed mix need planted with a tractor, or can I just broadcast it with my hands? Because like we don't own a tractor, so or when does this need planted and what soil type, and is there even enough topsoil for this thing to grow? So I mean, again, that's a project we're tackling this year, but it's definitely another learning area for us.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the lambs
Mhm,
too. So you also talked that you have a kind of a mixed breed
mhm.
flock too. So kind of share a little bit about that whole process.
Sure. So our Gulf Coast natives are only purebreds, and again, those are a landrace breed from the American South, and technically they're classed as a meat breed. So, and they're very feral. So what that means is their survival instincts are top notch. We joke that they are our apocalypse sheep. If you
Uh-huh.
know what hits the fan, those are the sheep we're going to fall back on. What that also means is that they're very wild, and they're survival instinct means that as soon as I pull the lamb off the ewe, her milk supply will start drying up. So I have to milk share with those sheep, or I'm not getting any milk. So I have that group, and then I have my dairy crosses who have more, you know, they have genetics that are more used to working with humans, so they're not as finicky with the lambs. But I do leave the lambs on with them and do lamb sharing with them as well, just because I feel like it makes healthier lambs long term. So it's either healthier meat or healthier replacement members of my flock, or I can sell starter flocks to other people. So what I do is I typically let the lambs have all the colostrum they want for the first 2 weeks. And with my dairy sheep, I do need to milk out a little bit extra because the lambs can't consume all of it. But with the Gulf Coast, the
Okay.
lambs get all of it. So first 2 weeks is colostrum, and I do try to make sure I always have a little bit of colostrum in the freezer just in case an emergency happens. Um, and then after 2 weeks, I will start separating the lambs for 12 hours, and we'll harvest the milk at the end of that 12 hours and then leave the lambs with the ewes. So it kind of waffles back and forth each year if we're going to separate the lambs in the nighttime and we milk in the morning, or if we separate the lambs during the daytime and we milk in the evening. And that's based off my husband's schedule because he does work off farm.
Okay. So talk a little bit about like stocking rates. Like how many sheep per acre are you able to typically have?
The stocking rate is like the general rule is 4 to 6 sheep per acre. We have eight and a
Okay.
half acres, and right now we have around 25 sheep. I think we might be a little heavy at the moment, but we are still kind of playing with what our property can handle or not handle. And then, looking at the numbers of how much off farm feed are we needing to bring in to support them and to maintain the flock health. So, I mean, we probably should whittle things down to more like 15 sheep, but I have some favorites that I don't want to get rid of. So,
Yeah.
emotions really are terrible things when you're shepherding. Um,
Yes.
so, and then we also have two cows, which is a whole nother conversation. But it is really interesting seeing how the cows and the sheep, like when they want to eat something similar, when they want to eat something different. But with sheep, when you graze them on pasture, you really need to let that pasture rest for 2 months instead of 1 month, like with cows, because of the parasite issues. So the cows can still go back and regraze what the sheep have already done when the sheep have to stay off of that area.
Gotcha. Okay. You've mentioned parasites a couple times. Talk a little bit about kind of what the protocol is for managing those. You just mentioned one is keeping a cycle.
Yeah, so with dairy sheep, they kind of have this window about, I would say, a month to a month and a half after lambing, where all their reserves are used up and their resistance to parasites just plummet. And it took me a couple of years to realize that that's what was going on with my flock. So our biggest parasite issue is the barber pole worm, and you can check your animals for that by doing what's called the FAMACHA check, where you check their eyelid redness, and if their eyelids are super red and they're not anemic, but if their eyelids are pale, they're suffering from anemia, and it's a good bet that they have the barber pole worm. So um, again, with what the literature I was reading was saying was that you check them like once a month or once every 3 months. And what we realized is on our property with our animals, we need to check our ewes every week, given the fact that we were trying to do things low chemical, low propping up with off farm inputs. So, but then, all anyone wanted to talk about was the barber pole worm. And then I found out after the fact there were like 15 bajillion other parasites in addition to barber pole worm that don't show up with the FAMACHA checks. So, the parasites are a big learning curve, especially when you want to be as chemical free as possible and just do things naturally
Correct.
and all that kind of thing. So, we have like at first I was like, we're not using any chemicals whatsoever because chemicals are bad. And then the year I had my son, I was unable to really do anything with the sheep because of some postpartum complications. So We did use chemicals then, and I learned you really have to do herbal follow-up if you use chemicals, because when the chemicals go through and kill the parasites, the sheep can still die, because as those parasites die, they're leaving wounds in the sheep's digestive tract and they can still bleed
Oh,
out.
um, yeah. So these parasites basically attach themselves inside, basically the gut, the stomach, all those kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things. And
Yeah,
wow.
they're
Okay.
nasty. They're really nasty. I don't like them. Is the worst part of keeping sheep is the parasites. So, what we do is if we do give chemicals, we always follow up with a mixture of cayenne pepper, apple cider vinegar, and olive oil, and I will give that to my sheep orally for about a week. Since talking about that more, several people have informed me that the cayenne itself acts as a vermifuge that kills the parasites as well. So I'm going to be doing a little bit more playing with that to see if just the cayenne drench will be sufficient and we can avoid the chemicals
Uh-huh.
altogether. Because I mean, I'm not anti modern medication for myself or my critters. It's just there's so many side effects and potential fallout, and it's another expense that I just prefer to avoid them. And you're not sustainable if you're constantly having to run to the veterinarian or the doctor to get meds. So we do call for parasite resistance on our property, but you also have to be fair with the fact that again we're building our soil, we're rehabbing our pastures, we're asking a lot from these sheep to make enough milk for us and their babies and not need any help when it comes to parasites. So, and being really low grain too, because having the nutrition from the grain does help boost them and have resistance to the parasites. But then you cause other issues with the grain like rumen health and acidosis and all that gobbledygook. So
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
a huge balancing
Okay.
act.
Yes, there's a lot going on
Yeah.
here.
Are you tired of scrambling to keep your garden plan on track? Whether you're growing a backyard garden or running a market garden like me, Seed Time is the perfect way to simplify crop planning. With Seed Time's calendar, I can map out my entire growing season based on my exact location and growing zone. It tells me when to seed, transplant, and harvest, all with super easy click and drop system. The task feature is a game changer. I get a daily or weekly checklist that keeps me on track and makes sure I never miss a step. And no losing gardening notes anymore because the Seed Time Journal keeps everything organized in one place on your phone. It's the ultimate gardening calendar, helping me know exactly what to do and when to do it. Plus, we haven't even talked about their layout tool. For a limited time, you get $100 off lifetime access or 40% off your first year when you visit planwithseedtime.com to grab this deal today. That's planwithseedtime.com. Don't miss out on this game changer for gardeners, farmers, and homesteaders.
All right, so then let's talk a little bit about the sales channels with Homestead Dairy Sheep.
Mhm.
What are the different ways you can sell the products?
Yeah, so depending on your state and the laws, and disclaimer, 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 there is a market for sheep milk, and the market price is $40 a gallon.
Okay.
So I have sold, sheep milk by the gallon mainly to soap makers because you don't require a ton of the sheep milk in the soap batch. Um, there is a growing interest in Kentucky in sheep milk as a raw product from off farm. In our situation with the size flock we want to manage, it doesn't really make a ton of sense for us to have a herd share for our sheep. So what we have found works for us is to sell value added products from our sheep milk in the form of like soap or shampoo. Um,
Okay.
and then I have had a brainstorm of like if I can get a freeze dry or to freeze dry soap and then add it into like a bath mixture because milk baths are really, really good for your skin. So the
Uh-huh.
actual sheep milk revenue has predominantly come for us in the form of sheep milk soap. And I
Okay.
do have about a 50% profit margin when I do it that way.
Okay. And it sounds like your sheep milk soap got started kind of as like a fundraiser.
Yeah, so the I wasn't actually intending to be the dairy sheep girl of the homesteading world or write a book on this topic or anything like that. I was trying to get money for beehives. We had a very small flock at that point, and I was trying to raise money so we could get lay-ins beehives. And I made a couple batches of soap to sell as like a thank you for fundraising. And it
Uh-huh.
was the most successful failure because I kept having to reinvest my proceeds for the fundraiser in soap making equipment because people wanted more of that. And I kind of slipped on a banana peel, and our sheep milk soap making business was born. Which then led to me slipping on a banana peel and getting a book contract because as I sold the sheep milk soap, more and more people were asking, well, how do you milk a sheep and where do we get sheep milk to
Uh-huh.
make this soap for ourselves and that kind of thing. So it's a, we still kind of look at each other and laugh sometimes. We're like, how did this happen?
Yeah. 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 So all right. So talk a little bit about goat milk soap. Is that like a lye soap or
Yes, so you can get I think it's called hot process soap. I'm not entirely sure, but you can basically get bars of pre-made glycerin soap, and then you basically melt it and add the sheep milk to it, whatever else you want to it. I don't do that. I kind of feel like that's cheating. So I do it from scratch. I do lye. I get all the fats and oils myself, and it's this big chemistry project in my kitchen.
okay. All right. And then obviously the people want this, but they're also the different not flavors, but like scents and that sort of thing are probably pretty popular.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can if you make natural or soaps from scratch, it's a whole world. Like there's so
Yeah.
many things you can add to it. There's, you know, mica powders and different scents. Like I only use essential oils just because my body doesn't love fragrance oil, and so I'm not going to poison myself to make a product to sell to people.
Uh-huh.
Um
Uh-huh.
but on the flip side, that did give me a unique niche because people with eczema would just buy it in bulk because they were like, this is one of the few soaps we can use that's not causing a flare up. So,
Uh-huh.
um, a lot of people with severe food allergies or, some kind of chronic health issue are more familiar with, essential oils and sheep milk and the weird niches that I thrive in. Because they don't cause any kind of reaction, or if it causes a reaction, it's a very low reaction. And so they're able to enjoy it more.
Uh-huh. Okay. So all right, so you've got the goat milk soap. Obviously, you can sell the goat milk. What about the male lambs? Can you do a lamb out of that, or is the dairy sheep breeds just not that thing?
Well, I mean, they're not a meat breed per se like a Katahdin where they were designed to get big and fat really, really super fast.
Uh huh.
In my humble opinion, I have yet to taste a sheep that I don't think tastes delicious. My
Okay.
least favorite sheep meat is Katahdin. Um, Everyone
Okay.
talks about how hair sheep tastes better than wool sheep, and my experience has been the exact opposite has been true. I don't care for hair sheep meat, but that's just me. So yes, you can butcher the ram lambs in the fall. Again, they're slower growing breeds. But it still tastes good. I mean, it's meat. It's very delicious tasting meat.
Yeah.
We don't actually do that too often simply because I have such a demand for breeding stock. So I mean,
Okay.
I think this
Okay.
fall was the first year we had a ram that just didn't sell, and I'm not really keen on trying to sell him just because he's not genetically expressing really good potential. And so we're like,
Uh
wait,
huh.
we have we have meat from lambs we can eat now. Yay, this is great. Typically what we will eat is either older ewes that have retired out of breeding, and that's typically because either age or a health issue, or we have had a couple lambs that early on in our breeding program, that's before we got the right minerals, they were having some skeletal issues. And so
Uh
we butchered them because I mean, they were getting crippled the older they got. So if the lamb is healthy and intact and, you know, going to have a good adult life, typically that lamb is sold to other dairy shepherds wanting to start up.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And then obviously, if you do process lambs, you got the full range. Maybe you can go from like lamb sausage to all the different things. What is the typical pack out? I forget. It's not that's not the word I'm looking for. But from the live weight to actually what you get when you take your box of meat home.
I am not 1,000% sure about that because, like I said, our predominant market is selling live animals, and we've only butchered a couple of our own sheep at this point. I will
Mm,
say that when you're butchering a sheep, especially if it's a wool breed, number one, you've got to factor in the weight of their fleece and their hide, but then you
yes.
also have to calculate in their rumen takes up a huge amount of their stomach cavity. Like by the
Mm,
time you eviscerate the sheep, there's very most of the sheep's stomach is the digestive tract. So I mean the first time we brought home our box of meat from the butcher, we were like, "Where is the rest of this animal?" And they were like, "It was the
mhm,
stomach." Like, this is it. We
yeah.
promise. Now I have had to get up in our butcher's face and say, "If you throw away any of the sheep fat ever again, I will come in here and cry and not leave until you give it back." So,
Yes,
um,
yes, yes.
now, sheep fat is unique in that it is a very hard fat. Traditionally, people did not do a lot with sheep tallow if it was off of a lamb chop or something like that. As far as eating it, it's not really a culinary fat you want to cook with or make pie crust with. But what they did is they would make sheep fat tallow candles. And I
Oh,
have made sheep tallow skincare that is just phenomenal. So
very
that was
interesting.
kind of a shock when we were trying to like render the sheep tallow for cooking with, and we were like, "This is not that great. Why is this not that great?" And then when I looked it up, it was like, well, historically, sheep fat has been used more for external applications, not internal. So that is just one thing to be mindful of.
Yes. All right. So I did do some Googling
Hmm.
here, and take home is it's saying it's calling it take home meat, which I know it's not the right word, but they're saying it's about if it's a 120-pound lamb,
Hmm.
you're gonna take home about 40 to 55 pounds.
Yeah,
So
that sounds about right.
th- yeah, 30%, 30 to 40% probably is what it ends up being. But
Yeah.
um
So with
yeah, and obviously,
yeah,
yeah.
so with dairy sheep, I mean, we do use a local Amish butcher just because my husband's in emergency services and time is way more valuable to us right now. But
Yes.
if you are a dairy shepherd, it does behoove you to learn home butchery skills simply for that
Correct.
cost point.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, especially if you're a homestead. If you're a farm, you're gonna be selling to a consumer, you're probably gonna want to do um a inspected facility. But
Right,
yeah,
right,
if
right,
you're just
right.
doing it for
Well, and too,
yeah,
like if you're doing like a like you say, you're a farm and you're selling to other people and you're a dairy, like the meat aspect is going to be more a side product. Your main
uh-huh.
product is the milk itself. And so, that's
Correct.
one thing that I'm trying to learn how you do the math algorithm to figure all that out. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah.
yeah. And the proper work terminology is cut weight or retail cuts weight.
Oh, okay. Well, I
So
learned something today.
it's one of those things. I mean, I've again worked with meat for a number of years, and so I should know all
Right.
that, but it's right now my brain is full of other things.
Yes, yes. But congratulations, by the way. Baby newborn brain is a very uh big thing.
It is. Yes, it is. The biggest mistake I made, and this is interesting, like every child has been something different. And this baby, the day after, I had to return a U-Haul truck.
Oh no. Oh
Yeah,
no.
I did exactly what you think I did. Now, granted is so I'm returning it. I'm on the way. I stop. I put diesel in it. I fill it up with diesel like I'm supposed to, and then I get back on the road because you always fill up and then you go drop it
Right.
off. Well, as I'm getting to drop it off, I noticed that it's not stuck on full, and you have to return it stuck on full. So, again, this is 6 a.m. in the morning. The baby was born 3 days before. I have not
Right.
slept. So I pull into a second a gas
Mhm.
station, and it right in the sign it says diesel. It's in green. I pull up to a pump that has a green nozzle, and it
Oh.
also has a red nozzle. And I'm like, oh yeah, red nozzle gas, green nozzle
Oh
diesel.
no.
Yeah. So I thankfully I didn't start it. I literally realized it. And because I couldn't figure out how to get more fuel in it, I was more focused on how do I get that last little bit of fuel in so I don't pay the surcharge compared to, oh, the other green nozzle at the other pump on the other side is actually where you need to be. So,
I am so sorry.
and I am the guy that makes fun of all these people out there that can't mess this up. Cause I know I've had diesel trucks my entire life. I should know better.
Right.
So anyway, but I did not start it. So I did not destroy the
Well, that's
engine.
good.
I called them and I said, guys, there's news you do not want to hear, but I'm going to, point out that I didn't destroy your truck.
Right.
All you're going to have to do is drop the fuel tank. I did end up confessing to my local mechanic, and he's like, yeah, Michael, I probably could have gotten you out of that for half the cost of what you ended up having to pay on that.
And you're like, why are you telling me this? Just
Well, I kind of wanted to say in the future, what should I do? He said, not that I'm ever going to do this in the future,
Right.
because we're not having any more. 4 is enough. We're not having any more kids. My brain will not be addled like this again. But yes, anyway,
Yeah.
so they finally sent me the bill for it, and it really wasn't bad. In all honesty, it was like $600,
Okay.
and that was a 26-foot truck. They had to come basically pick up, haul up to their plant. So they had a tow bill. Then they also had to several hours of mechanic time, and then again, it was a 60-gallon tank. So that's $200 in fuel right there.
Mhm. Wow.
So in all honesty, it really wasn't that bad. A stupid tax, but I have another story to tell.
That is true. You definitely do.
So yes,
Oh.
where did we get off on this? I forget, what were we talking
You
about?
were saying you couldn't think of words, and I said, "Well, that's
Oh,
because you have
yes.
baby brain, and you
Yes.
just wanted to make sure I
Yes.
understood how baby brained your brain was." So,
Yes. Yeah, that is the case.
yeah,
All right, well, let's wrap this up here. Homestead sheep is not for everyone.
yeah.
Let's give us a little bit of like, who's it not for?
You know, when I go and speak at events, I will typically have several people come up and thank me because they'll say, "I've always wanted to have sheep, but I couldn't think of a practical application to own sheep for."
Okay.
There's people who, they buy cows and they love cows and the cows are their dream come true. And they're like, well, let's throw some sheep in there. And they go, why the heck did we buy sheep? Those are the folks I'd be like, you're a cow person. Don't do the sheep.
Yeah. Well, I think too, there's always that fence aspect too, is that a lot of people don't realize the special requirements for sheep fence, especially year-round sheep fence. Like, it's one thing to have an idyllic pasture in the summer and throw up some netting,
Mhm.
but then in the middle of the winter, that netting has ice on it and disappears. And so you better have some better, or you move your sheep inside, obviously. But
Right.
small ruminant fencing is no joke.
Well, I guess that kind of brings up an interesting point. I mean, with sheep, you cannot be a legalistic person. If you are dead set that you are going to run your property in a specific certain way, come hell or high water, the sheep are going to challenge your God complex, and you're not going to do that.
Okay.
So, they will humble you. And so a lot of people want to go, oh, well, that's because sheep are stupid. And I'm like, you're not a shepherd, because they are very intelligent creatures, but they make really crappy humans. And they
Yeah.
really don't want you to think that you're, a bigger can of diet soda than you actually are. So, most of the people who I know who just love sheep, and they've had sheep for years and they're going to be sheep shepherds until they die. Those are the people who are all going, sheep will force you to experience every single emotion in the book. And you are always going to be learning, and you're always going to be, thinking about your sheep and how to manage them. But you like that. So, I mean, when I interviewed
Uh-huh.
the Romanian shepherd for my book, he was like, I'm traveling in the Carpathian Mountains for 6 months of the year on donkeys, because where we're going, there's no
Ah,
roads. And I absolutely love
uh-huh.
it. There people in my village think I'm crazy, but this is not a hugely lucrative job, and it's hard, and it's work, and it's hard work, and it's emotional work. And I just absolutely love it. So, I mean, what
Uh-huh.
he said is, if you think you're supposed to be a shepherd, understand that you're either supposed to be a shepherd or you're not supposed to be a shepherd. And if you're not
Uh-huh.
supposed to be a shepherd, don't be one because you won't like it. So, by that aspect, I think a lot of us kind of have just this dream of having sheep. And if we can realize that dream, it doesn't matter if we have to get up at 2 a.m. and pull a lamb and then bring it inside and wake up every 2 hours to feed that lamb. We love what we
Uh-huh.
do. So, and on the other hand, too, like my body just prefers sheep milk. We have an A2
Uh-huh.
A2
Uh-huh.
Jersey cow. She's grass fed. She's very, very well kept. And I can tell a huge difference in how my body's functioning when I am using her milk and her milk products versus my sheep milk products. So, I think a lot of hype is around how many people aren't, quote, supposed to be drinking dairy, unquote, either because of their um, bioindividuality or because they're adults or
Correct.
whatever.
Yeah.
And I would contend, it's only in America where we say milk only comes from cows.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
milk a
Yeah.
lot of different critters in other countries, and it's not just goats and sheep. They milk camels, they milk water buffalo, they milk
Correct.
donkeys.
Yeah.
And,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
when we return to what, these quote less civilized unquote groups are doing, a lot of times we have a lovely side effect of we feel better. So, again, my heritage is Polish, and the Polish mountain people are famous for a specific kind of sheep milk cheese.
Uh-huh.
I like some goat milk, but not particularly. Well, my background is not in goat milk, it's in sheep milk. So,
Uh-huh.
I think that's one thing for people to kind of look at too, is what is your genetic makeup and is that something your body would prefer?
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the health aspect, a lot of people don't think about that when they're thinking about getting into it.
Yeah.
Obviously, another one is size too. Is obviously it's a lot easier to handle some female sheep. I know rams can be their their own thing.
Well,
I've
and
dealt with
I
rams
I
before.
will say, we had this guy from a professor come out the second year we had our homestead, and we were explaining to, because he was like, "How do you manage your roosters and all your male animals?" And we were like, "Well, if you're a jerk, you go in the freezer."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he's like, "So
Uh-huh.
you have an evolution of morality on your farm? If you're immoral, you die?" And we're like, "You know what? Yes, that is what we do. We believe in the stockade." And, we just kind of went and joked with him a little bit after that because we could.
Yes. Yeah.
But, like
Yeah.
rams kind of get a bad reputation. And I will say, if your ram is stalking you and trying to hurt you, he needs to become Easter dinner. Now
Uh-huh.
there is rut season, which, I have begun really talking about, because in the fall, when all the male deer are out spraying all their hormones everywhere and the hunters are getting their gear out, your rams are going to start acting a little more uppity. And, that,
Spicy.
yeah. And that's because their hormones are going nuts. And so if you throw them in with a bunch of girls, they'll be happy. But
Uh-huh. Yeah.
if you keep him off by himself, he's not going to be happy. And if you just waltz into what he sees as his flock now, he's not going to be happy. So you do have to bear in mind how he was created to operate, and you respect that. Um, and two, we've discovered that our rams do better if they have a flock of their own, which, works for genetic diversity. Not everyone can do that. But there are always rams available on all the boards that I'm on. Like, everyone has rams that they intended for the freezer and they ended up being really sweet, or they grew out really beautifully, so they don't want to butcher them. So I mean, if you're on a small property and you can't keep a ram flock, you can acquire a terminal sire,
Uh-huh.
relatively,
Yeah.
it's doable. So
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the RAM management is different. Like, sheep AI is not a thing for a couple different reasons. So if you're going to do dairy, you need to have access to a RAM, and you need to know how to work with him. There's some tricks. You don't treat him like a pet. You don't scratch him on the forehead, etc., and so forth. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, they're different species than any other livestock. So a lot of people will get into trouble when they are like, I've raised chickens and pigs and I've had cows, and so I just got some sheep, and then chaos and mayhem ensued. And I'm like, well, yeah, sheep are totally different from all the other animals. But once you understand how they're different, you can have a really beautiful symbiotic relationship with them. But again, you have to have that humility. You have to be willing to learn.
Correct. Yeah. All right. And they can remind us what your book is and where they can get it.
Sure. So my book is The Guide to Homestead Dairy Sheep, and it's available on my website, which is whoopsiedaisyfarm.com, or it's available from my publisher at sawdustpublishing.com, and it is also available on Amazon.
Okay.
Our farm name is Whoopsie Daisy Farm. And so we have a website. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and at the request of multiple people who I'm slightly resentful for, I am trying to flare back up my YouTube channel this year and start a podcast. So the YouTube channel is Whoopsie Daisy Farm as well.
Okay. And you can go on your website and you have a bunch of, you have an ebook, you have yarn, you have soap, you have wool, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so my ebook is 5 uses of wool for the homestead, because we really didn't even touch the whole wool dynamic of dairy
correct.
sheep. So,
yes.
Just a really quick thing, dairy sheep, there are no hair dairy sheep breeds at this time. Several people are working on it, but if you want a dairy specific breed, they are all woolly, and a lot of people are intimidated by that. And so I'm trying to help get rid of the intimidation, because wool is another really valuable homestead product that most people just aren't aware of. You just need to know what you're doing to manage it.
Yeah. And I think, you talk about how there used to be more sheep in Vermont than people, and how the U.S. wool has just completely cratered. And that is true in one aspect, but there still is absolute niche wool producers that are crushing it. I mean, I think my favorite story is a farmer I interviewed. It was an 1814 farm or something like that.
Oh, wow.
But she created this these little bird things, which she stuck outside, and they filled them with wool from their baby doll sheep. And she was getting hundreds of dollars per pound for all her wool. And she was selling out
baby doll sheep wool?
Yes.
That's impressive, because baby doll sheep are the chihuahuas of the sheep world. Let me just go on record for saying.
Yes. So it basically tells, again, you think about it, is that it's basically, it's for the birds, so they don't really care if it's good. But she's built this marketing machine around these baby doll sheep and how cool they are, and everyone wants it. So there absolutely is, and I think, again, you tell a story behind it, and a really good wool sweater that will last you for your entire lifetime if you do it right.
I mean, wool can last hundreds of years. I mean, when I went and toured Castle in England, there were these beautiful wool tapestries that were around when Anne Boleyn and King Henry were around. I mean, that was a couple hundred years ago. So, I mean, they're finding wool caches in these burial mounds that are still usable because of how they were processed and created. So, I mean, not everyone wants to make heirloom clothing, but I mean, some friends of mine in Florida, they insulated their sheep barn with wool, and the temperature outside their building was 120 degrees. Inside their building was 80.
Wow.
And all they used to insulate was wool. So, I mean, you can compost it, you can mulch with it. I mean, there's lots of ways that wool can add value to your enterprise, without going through all the turn it into yarn process.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot there. We could do a whole other podcast, I'm sure, on wool sheep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely could.
Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Michael. It was great talking with you.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.